You're listening to The Tiny Bloodthirster, a competitive Warhammer 40k podcast.
Hello, I'm the Tiny Bloodthirster, and today we're going to look at some of the recent Warhammer 40,000 tournaments and the top lists from these events. I've been collecting tournament results all month, and today I'm going to break it down into digestible nuggets. So how does this work? I'm going to look at GTs and majors from September, take just the lists that were greater than 0.79 win-loss, so basically that means you just have to have a 4-1 record or better, and then break down how many of these lists each unit's appeared in. I'm using Frontline Gaming standards to determine what is or isn't a GT, so that means an event has to have 28 or more players and 5 or more rounds to qualify. This does not have to be an ITC event specifically to qualify. In September, I identified 91 lists from 14 different events, so let's dive right in. Let's start by looking at the codexes. I've changed my format this month because some people didn't love last month's pie charts. Another thing I added was a point of equity. So let me explain myself. Every time I post one of these, people complain about what they think is or isn't balanced. That's pretty much par for the course for any discussion about competitive board gaming for any combat system. 40k is no exception here, and honestly, I think it's healthy to talk about these things. What nobody ever talks about is how to define quote-unquote balance. Personally, I don't think anyone wants 40k to be perfectly balanced with all data sheets equally good. Now, before you grab your pitchforks, let me explain. For one, that would make a boring game, because you would just buy the coolest looking models and play the game until you get sick of those models before moving on to some other game. Instead, we have this constant flux of rules and points values, and that means that today's trash could become tomorrow's OP and vice versa. I personally think that's fun. That gives us variety, while it also simulates the chaos of a galaxy that's torn by war by different factions that are always rising and then falling with each victory or each defeat. The reality is that Space Marines are the most popular faction. They have arguably the coolest models and some of the coolest lore, so a lot of people pick up that army. Almost every veteran 40k collector I know has at least one power armor army lying around in their closet. This is just a reality of the meta. There are a whole lot of Space Marine players. Even before the notorious 8.5 codex that's made Space Marine so good, if you went to a tournament, roughly half of the players would have some sort of Space Marine army. If we made every data sheet equally balanced, then Space Marines would just dominate the meta even more, because there's so many damn players. And that's fine, nothing against Space Marine players. Personally, I have an army myself. But I think what people really want is something between equity and equality in this game. Equality, I guess we could loosely define as we all have the same chance, whereas equity has equal results. I'm going to show you a cartoon here that I love because it illustrates the difference. Honestly, it's been shared a bajillion times online to the point where I can't even find the author to credit them, but whoever you are, thank you, and I hope you don't mind if I use your work to illustrate my point. If we had equal balance, then Space Marines should account for about half of the meta wins. That's not what anyone actually wants. They want to see their favorite faction win, regardless of whether or not that's Space Marines. And they want to make sure their army is competitive. In this chart, I created a point of equity. I took the total number of codexes. I counted Marines, Blood Angels, and Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Death Watch, all as one codex for the sake of this, and divided by 100. So that gives us about 5%. So in my mind, the closer a codex is to 5% of the top lists, the more equitable or more balanced it is. Looking at this chart, we can see that Space Marines are still the number one codex this month, just like they were last month. We'll see if next month's codex nerf to Master Artisan and points increases are enough to bring them down a notch, or if the +1 wound on Firstborn will make them just even stronger than they already are. Breaking out in the second place are Chaos Demons. This chart can be a little misleading because most of them were in soup lists, with only a handful of mono demons actually making the top tier. A popular army was Death Guard, which is why they made it to third place by allying with these Chaos Demons. Harlequins this month kept their respectable third place rank. If you look at the bottom, Dark Angels, Death Watch, Chaos Knights, Necrons, and Tau are the only factions without any qualifying wins. The rest of the factions are pretty close to that line of equity, so I think it's safe to say that 40k is still mostly balanced at this point. There's just a few overpowered or underpowered factions that might need nerfed or buffed. So now I'm going to move on to talking about specific sub-factions, starting with the Astartes. At first, it appears that White Scars are the most popular sub-faction with 6 top-tier lists. However, if you combine Salamanders with all their successors, they merge at the top with 8 lists. I'm not convinced the Salamanders will hold on to the crown next month, although they could. They're still got really strong stratagems, since Master Artisan is getting nerfed. But most of the other chapters did get a seat at the table, which is nice to see. Even got a Templar player in there. That was cool. Dark Angels and Death Watch were the only notable exclusions. If we drill down into specific units, we can look for a list archetype. Captains and Eradicators are at the top, just like last month. In this case, I counted all unnamed captains like Captain on Bike, Captain in Terminator Armor, Primaris Captain, Wolf Lord, etc. All is just one unit. Well, one surprise is that Devastators made the top 3. They've always been kind of good, but I guess I thought personally that with the price increase they weren't viable anymore. But there were an awful lot of them this month. Every single one I saw had grav cannons, and they rode into transport. Most of those were drop pods, but there were a couple players that used rhinos. I'm guessing that if the terrain is too dense, then if you're expecting that, then you're expecting it to be hard to land your drop pod, because those models are really big if you've ever seen one actually unfold, especially if you open the doors. So if you expect there to be a lot of terrain, then I imagine the Rhino is the better option, and that might have been what their thought process was. Intercessors and Scouts tied for most popular troop choice, showing up in 14 of these lists. In my games, I found that Intercessors are great backline objective holders. Scouts are good at performing actions, so this all made sense to me. After beyond that, the lists start to vary as we scroll down the list, and it really depends on what chapter you would choose from here. For example, if you're going to play White Scars or Blood Angels, then you might want to bring more melee units, while if you're playing Imperial Fists or Iron Hands, you're going to look for more ranged weapons. Let's talk about the Grey Knights next. There were only 2 top-tier lists in September, but both of them utilized the Grandmaster Dreadnought, a couple Strike Squads, a couple Terminators. Notice there was one list that used a Land Raider. That guy's absolutely crazy. I wonder how many times he got blown up by Eradicators or Haywire Bikes. But either way, great job to both those players. Let's move on to the Imperial Guard. There were several Guard lists in September. Most of them had allies, but there were a couple mono Guard lists. The regiments are all over the board here, and it's not clear to me yet which one is best or most popular among the top players. I think they're going to need to get some more games in to figure that one out. Or if we drill down, we can see that company commanders and tank commanders are popular HQs. And most of these lists use infantry squads to hold objectives. And then Manticores were the artillery of choice. So we have kind of a strong core battalion detachment using just those units, and you can tack on whatever tools you need from there or bring in allies as it may be. Next are the big boys, Imperial Knights. I was personally surprised by the number of Knight lists in September, especially since there were no Chaos Knight lists. Everything I've seen looks to me that, on paper at least, the Chaos Knights look like they're stronger than the Imperial Knights. But there were an awful lot of Loyalists. The majority of them were soup, but there were a couple Mono Knight builds that made it into the top lists. Volker and Krast were the most popular, but I don't think we have enough info here to identify a trend. Looking at the data sheets, the Crusader is the most popular of the Knights, but the Castellan may surprisingly be making a comeback. Anyone who played 8th edition competitively knows how much you have to prepare during list building to kill Knights. So everyone keep an eye on these guys, even if you don't play them, because if they continue to get more popular, then you're going to need to think about how you're going to deal with T8. How are you going to deal with invul saves on a T8 model, things like that. Let's talk AdMech. Mars is still the most popular sub-faction, but it may not be the auto-take that it appeared to be at the beginning of the edition, because there are a few other Forge Worlds here. If we drill down to the units specifically, I'm seeing a very clear archetype. You use raiders to run interference for the rest of army, which is mostly a gun line. These Cerberus raiders are stupid fast and are hard to pin down in melee. Downside is that they're very fragile, and while they have sniper rifles, they're kind of unimpressive. So you have to play them really cagey, or else they're not going to do anything for you. Breachers were the most popular gunline unit and troop. They're cheap, they're durable, they have good shooting, they can hold their own in melee. They have warlord traits and forge world traits that let them get exploding shots. This is really powerful. I think they're one of the best troops in the game. The only downside is that they don't have the best threat range, but you can fix that by bringing Manipulus, which is why so many players brought one. Next are the Sisters of Battle. There are only a few of these lists, but I think that's because most of the models are consistently out of stock, and they're already kind of an expensive army to collect. Otherwise, we would probably see more of these Sisters lists because I think they've got a lot of strong potential. The most popular sub-faction was Bloody Rose. Most of those were in soup lists. Every list had a canoness leading Repentia. Repentia traditionally struggled to get into combat, but the new missions really encourage players to pile into the middle of the board. You should reliably have all of your Repentia into combat by turn 2, I think, so they can rip and tear. Beyond that, the lists are all over the place. You still need a way to hold objectives, and ideally some sort of artillery to hit the opponent's backfield. That's where the Exorcist or some allied detachments come in handy. Moving on to the Banana Boys. While they had several wins, there doesn't appear to be one single sub-faction that is the most popular. Both the Dread Host and Shadowkeepers had a respectable 3 top-tier lists. Most of those lists were mono Custodes, because, let's face it, they're CP hungry, and there isn't much reason to spend CP on allies when Custodes can do almost anything they need to on their own. The lists are all over the place, and if there is a single archetype, I'm really not seeing it. There's just a lot of elite infantry and a lot of vehicles here, which is pretty much the whole Codex and Forge World range. The captain and basic troops were both popular. Overall, they appear to be a very balanced army with a lot of excellent toolbox of choices to pull from. I should mention the Imperial Agents. There were a few of them. Occasionally somebody would just bring one in a list. I think they're all a little overcosted, and characters bleed secondaries. So I'm not too surprised there's so few of them in the top list, but they do have their uses, which is why they showed up in some of these top lists. Let's move on to Chaos. Most of these lists, as I said earlier, were soup, so I decided to keep them all in one giant chart instead of splitting them up like I did with the Loyalists we just looked at. The Death Guard are pretty much set on Poxmongers, with only a few players trying other factions. Most demons were undivided because there was a patrol of Lord of Change with some Nurglings that you can tech into really any list, and it adds so much durability. However, there were a few mono Nurgle and mono Slaanesh lists out there that made the top tier. All of the Thousand Suns lists used Cult of Duplicity and were allies. The Cast Space Marines are all over the place. I think, unfortunately, have a weak codex, but they have a very powerful Psychic Awakening update, so it's hard to find a single faction that is better than the others because of all the different stratagems, relics, and warlord traits that each sub-faction has. If we zoom in to look at the data sheets, the Nurglings are sitting happily at number 1 with a whopping 9 lists. These guys might be the best troops in the game. They're durable, they can infiltrate, their objectives secured, they don't give up secondaries easily because they don't have the infantry keyword. Almost every Chaos list had a patrol of 1 HQ, which was usually that Lord of Change, and then several Nurglings to back them up. Next is Death Guard. They love their demon engines, and they love their characters. A lot of foul blight spawns, plague burst crawlers out there, because they're some of the best leaf blowers in the game. Seriously, Salamander Aggressors might be the only better flamer that you can pick up. Chaos Space Marines, they're all over the place. There was an Emperor's Children /Demon /Thousand Suns soup list that had a lot of Noise Marines backing up the other factions. Another list I saw was Black Legion and Iron Warriors soup with a lot of demon engines and characters. The third list was a Nurgle soup that featured a Sorcerer and Chaos Space Marine squad, and there was really only CSM in that army. And they were just squeezed into a Nurgle detachment with some other soup. Last 1,000 Suns, they were solely used as Psyker support. You can really easily bring a patrol of these guys, just a Psyker plus a Rubric Marine squad, or you could just put Magnus in a Supreme Command detachment, and those are just really easy to tech into other Chaos factions. Next are the Eldari. The vast majority of these lists were mono Harlequin, but there were a few soup lists mixed in here. Soaring Spite and Frozen Stars are neck and neck for best sub-faction. I guess it really depends on whether you prefer to shoot your enemy with Haywire and Fusion or charge them with Zephyrglaives and Cresses. If we drill into the data sheets, Harlequins have a clear archetype. 2 HQs, several troops, 3 Haywire bike units, and a Death Jester. This is a powerful core battalion. The troops are hit very hard, even though they're made of paper. But those bikes can get across the board very easily and do a lot of damage, especially if your opponent has vehicles. The Death Jester himself is very underwhelming offensively and defensively, but he's very cheap for a character, so you can just park him on an objective and score primary points, or you could try and complete some secondary actions. Some players were adding Star Weavers, Solitaires, or Ynnari to taste. In my experience, the list is very matchup dependent. It can depend on 2 things. One, if your opponent has no vehicles, then the bikes are going to struggle to perform and get all their points back. Also, the list is very fragile, so you need a lot of terrain to avoid getting shot off the board in the opening turns. If one of these things are missing, then you're going to have a really uphill battle. And these are some glaring problems with the army and challenges you should consider before running Harlequins in your next tournament. But they are very strong, obviously, or else they wouldn't be so high in these charts. There weren't a lot of Craft World lists, but 2/3 of them used triple Wraith Lords, so that's a thing. The third list was just a couple Psychers and Defenders and a Patrol to add some psychic support to the Harlequins. The only Drukhari list I found was a mix of Artisans of Flesh, Cabal Blackheart, and a homebrew Craft World. Let's move on to the Orcs. Both Death Skulls and Goths were popular. Is it Goths or Joffs? Tell me in the comments what the correct pronunciation is. Most of these were monoclan with one list that used Orc Soup. Looking at the data sheets, the Green Tide is still going strong. Most lists had lots of boys, Meganobs, and Commandos that were supported by some combination of 3 characters in that battalion. Notice how high up Gazkul is. I love that model. Happy to see that. Last, and not least, are the Tyranid factions. There were 2 lists. One was a mix of Kronos and Leviathan. The other was Twisted Helix with a custom hive. Both lists used Broodlords, Termagants, Hormagaunts, and a Lictor. It's a little rough to be a bug in this meta, but 2 Horde lists that went 4-1 and better, that confirms that this could be a viable archetype. So maybe a little more playtesting, a little more experience. We might see some more Tyranid hordes pop up in the future. But they've got a lot of problems as well with that book. So that covers it for September. The data for today's events came from the YHB Labor Day GT, Invasion 40k, Clan Wars Team Series, Circle City Tournament, Indominus Rising Final, Brisbane 40k GT, Iron Man, Fields of Blood 2020, Red Rock Exterminatus, No Retreat 9, San Antonio Shootout, Stay Safe and Play Warhammer, WCT GT Part 2, and Iron Halo. If you want to look at any of these lists yourself, you can find them all on the Best Coast Pairings app or Down Under Pairings website. The Indominus Rising Final list, you have to find them on a Google Doc link that they put on their event's Facebook page. Now, before we end, I would like to close with 2 questions that I would like you, the listeners, to answer. First of all, how do you think we should define balance? Do you think there's a better way to measure it than the point of equity that I put here in this chart? Is there any additional information you would also like me to track, like relics, warlord traits, psychic powers? And you can tell me how knowing what the top players are bringing would be useful to you. If you don't think you would get any use out of that information, then I don't want to waste a bunch of time building it. These posts already take me several hours a week to build, so I'd rather not add to it unless you can give me a good reason. Another thing I'm kind of curious is, do you guys think that would be something worth paying for? I might make something like this exclusive for Patreons and then release the normal charts for free like I've been doing. I'm not trying to sound greedy, but the reality is that each of these posts takes me a lot of time to compile, and I'm not making money on this project. I'm doing it solely out of love for the game and this community. it's kind of hard for me to justify spending any more time than I already have on this when I have other stuff like my job that I can bring in income. Not complaining, it's just the reality I'm in right now. If I can pick up some Patrons, I would be willing to definitely put in extra time and effort to provide them with some exclusive or even early access content. So if that's something you guys would be interested in, let me know and I'll explore those options. Just post in the comments below. Again, all of the charts from this episode are in the description along with a link to my Patreon. Until next time, everybody, peace out.